approach to providing services for people experiencing violence and/or marginalization. So I'll now turn the digital space over to Dr. Wathen, who will present on mobilizing knowledge for wicked problems, lessons learned from a gender-based violence research.
Great, thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to the center and to the organizing committee for inviting me to present at this conference. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you're all seeing my slides. Before I begin, though, I would like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from what's now called London, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dishwith One Spoon Covenant Wampum. And I'd say, especially on this day of national awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, I pay my respects to elders past, present, and future, and commit to conducting my work in a way that advances reconciliation and allyship with Indigenous colleagues and their goals. So I also thank you, Kelly, for your very thoughtful land acknowledgement and getting us going on the right foot here for this conference. So I will talk today about what I do, which is try to mobilize knowledge in the area of gender-based violence. I've been doing this work for quite a long time. I'd like to share some of my lessons learned. I will say most of my lessons learned have been the hard way in this space. But maybe start with a little bit about knowledge mobilization. What's all the fuss? Why should you care? Like I say, these lessons learned, and then some proposed solutions that have occurred to me over the years and that I've written about, and hopefully a little bit of time for Q&A. The logos that you see here are a number of projects, networks, programs that I've led or co-led in the areas of violence, gender-based violence, domestic violence at work. That was an interesting set of studies. The Equip Healthcare Research Program, which is about enhancing health equity, primarily in healthcare, but starting to expand into other sectors, including policing and so on. And then the Gender Trauma and Violence Knowledge Incubator, which really was a sort of academic community grassroots partnership that arose to address some of these gaps in how we can better mobilize knowledge in these areas into policy practice and the public realm. So, knowledge mobilization, what is it? Well, there are lots of different terms for what we call KMOB. In fact, when I first started doing this work, primarily as a CIHR funded researcher, we talked about KT, or knowledge translation. I think many of us kept wanting to enhance that a little bit. We add an E for knowledge translation and exchange, built on older models of dissemination, diffusion, and so on. There are lots of different terms for this process that we're talking about. More recently, we hear about things like implementation science, how to take an intervention that's been proven effective in research and sort of embed it into systems or into practices, protocols, and so on. I like the term knowledge mobilization. And it's not only because my CRC is funded by SSHRC or that this conference is funded by SSHRC, but in fact, I think there are some useful components of SSHRC's definition of knowledge mobilization that are quite interesting and hopefully we'll unpack a little bit throughout this talk. So I've purpled some of the terms in SSHRC's definition and anything I cite, you'll see the URL at the bottom and I'm happy to share slides afterwards. But the notion of reciprocity, I think, is really important. And the idea that knowledge flows, okay, it's not unidirectional. I'll talk about that a little bit. It really is about a multi-directional flow of ideas because it's not always just a nice prepackaged bit of knowledge that you can pick up. I like the fact that SSHRC's definition talks about multiple actors in this space, including, very importantly, knowledge brokers. And I do want to talk about knowledge brokers and that sort of really key function a little bit later on. And then the idea that obviously we're going beyond academia. And this, is not equally applicable to all types of research that are conducted within the academy, obviously. Basic forms of research, there are forms of historical or other research that may or may not have a direct application, and that's absolutely fine. So I do think we need to remind people that not all knowledge is immediately mobilizable into policy and practice, and we need to keep that important space for curiosity-driven research and those other forms of scholarly activity that may not get to the point of actionable messages right away. And then I guess the other term here is impact. And everybody is very, very concerned about impact. I would say, just to preempt one of my key messages, how do we measure impact? How do we even define impact, let alone measure impact when we're talking about knowledge that is flowing through complex systems in complex ways? So this is sort of the definition. And I would say, why we care is because we have to care right now. I call this slide Researcher Imperatives. I just basically did a screen capture off of SSHRC's funding site. So this is in the application regulation section of SSHRC. Many of you who are funded by SSHRC or similar sorts of bodies in other countries know that we have to develop these knowledge mobilization plans now as part of our research grants. I could show you a similar page from CIHR, which is our National Health Research Funder. I could also show you one for NSERC, which is the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council. So there are imperatives around doing this. It is hard now to write a grant application that doesn't include some idea beyond our traditional ways of communicating with one another within the academy to do this work of mobilizing knowledge into the broader world, if you will. And it's not just in the academy. Actually, I call this slide evidence-based everything, because I think that's sort of the world we live in. And here I've just pulled a few screen captures from one of our national newspapers, the Globe and Mail, and it really is talking about evidence-based care and why aren't we, making care decisions based on evidence. Another is from a nursing, the Canadian Nurses Association, and it's really about evidence-informed decision-making, evidence-based practice. One is from a policy site. It's Public Health Agency of Canada, the Canadian Best Practices portal. And again, I've circled systematic reviews. So this discourse is not just within the academy and within our funding bodies. It is prevalent. It exists out in the world as well. And I think, in fact, this might be an interesting point of discussion later. We've seen the notion of evidence and its impact and how we communicate it really come to light during COVID. It has sort of blown up all of the inequities, including inequities in access to an understanding of knowledge. So I think this whole thing is here to stay. But the other piece to remember, it's still a relatively new field. Like in terms of doing research on how best to translate research into practice and policy, it's the last couple of decades really where people have started to pay a lot of scholarly attention to this. So let's just unpack what we mean by knowledge to action or knowledge mobilization or knowledge translation. And I like this slide because this, in my experience, doing this for quite a while now, seems to be what people have in mind. Like this is the mental image that people might have around how to do this knowledge. And in this graphic, I would say translation work or knowledge transfer, some of the earlier terms that were applied to this process. Basically, you've got a producer of knowledge, a researcher, let's say, or a research team, or an entire university, but somebody who's actually doing the work of producing knowledge. And then on the other end, you've got a user, and the producer is in charge of packaging things up nicely, finding a way to get it to the user. And then the idea is the user picks the appropriate box off of this little conveyor belt, goes, oh, look, my knowledge is all ready to use, and plug and play, and off we go. The world is a better place. Rarely does this happen. I think I can't see any faces normally as I look out on an audience when I say this. Everybody's nodding, going, yeah, that's a little bit unrealistic. But it still seems to be the prevalent, at least mental image of what people are thinking of when they're thinking of getting knowledge into action or into policy and practice. You see a lot of pyramids in this work. I'm not exactly sure why knowledge mobilization, knowledge translation, people love pyramids so much. But the idea is at the bottom of the pyramid is all of that scholarly work that we do. We have our theoretical and methodological innovations. So what questions should we be asking? How do we go about asking and measuring qualitatively, quantitatively, mixed methods? All that stuff is going on at the bottom. Then we do our studies and we publish them in our articles and reports, fairly traditional academic media. Then this extra piece around synthesis, and this is certainly a science that has taken off in the last 10, 15 years. I think when I started doing systematic evidence reviews, there were a couple of techniques for doing that. Now there are many, many, many different forms and methodologies around systematic review, from realist reviews to scoping reviews to integrative reviews, et cetera, et cetera. And more, I think we see our master's students in particular taking on this as their thesis research in a master's, because it's a second form of secondary data analysis in a way, and it's something that you could sort of scope and manage. It all requires professional librarians. So I'll definitely do a shout out to our colleagues from LIS, because I think that we can't really do this work without that very unique and important skill set of finding all of the evidence. So you can do all of the synthesis. And then as you get to the top of the pyramid, you know, the idea is you're starting to produce messages that are actionable, that could help inform practice or program decisions, personal decisions, if your goal is to change public or patient or consumer or client behavior, and then policy and planning decisions. So again, the idea is of a funnel, that you're refining knowledge and evidence so that you can actually apply it to decisions. So again, this is another fairly common way that people think about knowledge mobilization and this process of getting knowledge to action. And this is the assumption. So this is where things start to, I think, get a little bit interesting. So we assume that when people are interested in making evidence-informed or evidence-based decisions, that they are taking the evidence and it has equal prominence with the other factors in the decision space, including many contextual factors. For example, are there resources to do this? Is there an opportunity? Is you know, the timing right to do this? Are the people there to do it? Is there willingness? Is there goodwill, etc.? So lots and lots of contextual factors. And then importantly, I would say there are also values. You know, do people want to take a vaccine or do they not want to take a vaccine? Regardless of what the evidence says, if the values don't align with what the practice or policy change is supposed to be, then you start to get into some issues. But the assumption when we talk about evidence-based practice or evidence-based policy is that evidence has a prominent and equivalent, or at least near equivalent, role in the decision space to these other factors, context and values. And that's, I think, again, where we start to get a little bit problematic. This next slide, it's not on my slide advanced techniques are working. I love this one. This is a graphic I found from these two authors that are listed at bottom here. And in some ways, this, you know, this is something that we all wish in our, I guess, in our fantasy lives, the fantasy model of direct impact. So we've done our great study, policymaker reads it, goes, wow, this is great, changes everything, and now we have no more poverty. This is obviously a fantasy. But, you know, it is, again, something that's in people's imaginations. If I just do a good enough job of doing my research, I can have some impact. Obviously, there's a lot more going on in any space where we would end up with practice or policy change. I've certainly never seen a pathway this simple to, you know, the ultimate outcome, in this case, you know, reductions or the end of poverty. I have seen some really impressive successes in terms of having policy influence with evidence, and I'm happy to share some of those examples a little bit later. So I would say, you know, starting to trouble these fairly simplistic ideas of conveyor belts of nicely packaged knowledge or the fantasy model of policy change is some of the challenges that we see when we actually get into this work. And the challenges, you know, are from all around, really. You have producer side challenges and user side challenges. And I've got sort of, you know, scare quotes around those two words, because in some types of research and in some contexts, it's actually hard to tell the difference between the producer and the user. And as I talk a little bit more about new models of integrated knowledge mobilization, you start to see partnerships where the producer and the user can be the same person or can change roles depending on which part of the process they're doing the research. So those of you who do participatory action research or other forms of community-based research kind of know that your colleagues, your knowledge users, are actually your knowledge producers as well. So those roles get blurred, but certainly if you think of traditional sort of research cycles, they take a lot of time. And I would say, you know, one of the things we really need to examine is whether academics are actually not just incentivized, but even disincentivized to do this work. So I remember when I was first starting to do it, there was no place on my CV to even put these partnered research activities and these, you know, talks that were outside the academy or documents that I created for policy partners. So we've got some mismatches in terms of the imperatives that I talked about before and the way that research is done and what's rewarded and incentivized in the academy. So that's something to keep in mind. On the user side, there's been lots of research on, for example, how health policymakers take up evidence and what the barriers are and so on. And really it comes down to not enough time, way too much information, not necessarily the skills, the technical skills to assess the quality of information, and not enough resources around you to take the time and effort to actually do that work. So you can't expect, for example, a busy social worker to be going directly to the literature and finding the 42 studies on the particular intervention that she's interested in implementing, and then figuring out if it's, if the evidence is good enough to change her practice. So we need those intermediary roles. And I would say that, generally these are not well resourced, these intermediary roles, and they're not often well articulated. So who does what? Often it's a researcher that sort of slips into this because they feel it's important to do. And it might be, a knowledge user who sort of pulls into it as well because they see that there's some value there. But I think we need to think about those intermediary roles a little bit more carefully. And if we really want to do this, assign some resources to it. I think the other thing that we have to remember, and even though I've been talking so far, the assumption is that the research knowledge that we produce will have a direct instrumental use for somebody. So it will be used to make a decision or change practice or do something immediate and measurable with it. But in fact, we know from many decades of studying how people take up information, why they take up information. These forms of knowledge have different uses. It can be conceptual, it can be symbolic. You really might be wanting to change somebody's mind about something, not necessarily to change their practice or to change their attitudes. You might be wanting to use knowledge to symbolize something else. So the point here is that, use is, it can be broadly defined. It's not always measurable or even visible, and it's certainly not always predictable or used in intended ways. And we have some interesting examples about how people have taken up different parts of our research to do things that we never would have predicted or intended. So I think that's another point to remember. Once it's out of your control, it's out of your control, and that's sometimes tough for researchers. So I would say the reality, going back to our Venn diagram here, is that really, even when there's a commitment to evidence-informed decision-making or policy and practice, the evidence piece actually takes, less of a role. And I'm being generous with the size of the circle here. Certainly in policy context, in my experience, the contextual factors and the values pieces really drive many of those decisions. Or they all have to be balanced in such a way that the evidence sometimes does not take the priority that we think it might when we're developing these knowledge mobilization strategies. And this little site here is an old chestnut at this point, but somebody did a study, and this was relatively simple evidence, like to change a particular clinical practice in a medical context. It takes 17 years from the time that we know something to the time that it's actually fully taken up and implemented in practice. So that's a stat that's sort of put out there quite a bit. Sometimes I think, things are very innovative and timely, they can take less time. But the idea here is we also have human nature to fight against, and people are comfortable doing certain things. And when you are asking them to change the way they do things, that's going to take some time and effort. So I mentioned there are, many models, and some of the newer work certainly builds on older models from different disciplines, including Rogers' diffusion of innovation and so on. So those early models really talked about the producer push, which was that that diagram I showed you before, that little graphic with the boxes on the conveyor belt. The idea being that the producer is in charge of just putting it out there. And this is sort of the build it and they will come approach to knowledge dissemination, that if you just do a good job of doing the work and then sharing it, people will take it up. But there's not necessarily any extra effort beyond that that's made to get that knowledge into policy and practice. A second form of model is the user pull model. So that is where perhaps a policy actor or clinical leaders will say, we actually need to do things differently. We need to look at the most recent evidence to see if what we're doing is the right thing to do. So they might come looking for evidence. They might come directly to researchers, or they might go to published literature or syntheses and so on. And I've put here CPE, which is just short form for continuing professional education, because I think that's actually really important and not always framed as knowledge mobilization type of strategy. So if you can embed emerging evidence into both pre-service training and in-service continuing education, for those who are already in the field, that is a really potentially very impactful mechanism for getting new research and new ideas into how people are doing things. And then these, more the newer models, although not new if you've been doing, like I said, participatory action research or community-based research, but the idea that you're partnering with those who are going to ultimately be the users of the knowledge that you're producing, and you're co-creating that knowledge. And this brings in a lot more stuff. And I know, having done a bit of research on the types of work that your center does, Kelly, and probably many of the colleagues that are in the room today, when you're doing work to mobilize justice, you are inherently doing partnered community-based work, and you understand that those relationships are extremely important, and they have to be maintained and nurtured and treated as that important asset to the research. And the researchers have to help build capacity in the users or decision makers, and vice versa. So I think it's important for researchers to come to this with a sense of humility and say, I don't really understand, this particular context. I need my partners to tell me how best to design a study and to collect data and then to communicate data that fits well with this particular decision-making context or social context, wherever it is that the work is being done. And it also, these integrated models rely on your partners helping to identify priorities. So that's another important piece. And you can kind of see this is really going against the traditional academic model of researchers making those upfront decisions about what they want to study, getting the funding, doing the work, and then sending the knowledge out into the world to do what it will. So this is a very different model. I think it does change the way that we have to do things if indeed we want to pursue these approaches. On the plus side, having that partnership and that co-production is the pathway to buy-in and relevance. So if your partners are on side with you and you're answering questions of relevance to them, it is much more likely that the knowledge will ultimately be used in those decision spaces. So these are trade-offs. It takes more time, more effort, a different type of effort than maybe many researchers are used to. But if what you want to do is have impact, then this is an important strategy to consider. So now I'm saying, that little conveyor belt image, maybe, things aren't as simple as that. And here, and I'm not going to walk through this entire diagram, but this is an early one from Ian Graham and colleagues. And Ian was head of knowledge translation at SSHRC for a number of years, so real deep expertise in this. But here you see a much more complex model, which really is about, how both to start that integrated knowledge translation process, identifying the problem with your partners, even after you've done that synthesis work. So in this case, the pyramid's kind of upside down, but it's really the same pyramid that I showed you before. But then how do you get that knowledge into these complex systems? So adapting for the context, looking at the barriers, selecting and tailoring, implementation interventions, monitoring, and then sort of into a continuous quality loop, identifying new problems and starting all over again. So as you can see, there's a lot more work involved here, more work, more complexity for both the researchers and the knowledge user partners, and then anybody who might be in between as a mediator or broker. So I just want to go through 4 main lessons that I've learned through all this, and maybe a few solutions. And I think I've got about 10 minutes to do that. So hopefully I'm not speaking too quickly. First of all, I like to draw models. They're not that pretty, but they're colorful. This just kind of breaks out and helps us understand what we've been talking about here. And it maps on pretty well to the SSHRC definition that I showed you before. But the traditional model of academia is really what's on the left side of this, right? That we do our research, we do our academic papers and our conferences. Maybe we do some what CIHR called end of grant work, which is some summaries and maybe some non-academic talks. We have to keep doing this, and not only because it goes on our CVs and that's what we get our promotion and tenure for, but also this is the evidence base, right? So as we talk about evidence-based practice or evidence-informed decision-making, the evidence is these peer-reviewed publications and then the synthesis of all of that. So that remains fundamental to the work. When I talk about knowledge mobilization, it's really all this other stuff. It is, understanding for the field that you're working in what the practice and policy priorities are, which means talking to those potential users, some of whom might become your partners. And that talking has to be intentional and strategic and ongoing. and then working with them to develop different types of products, because rarely will a policymaker read an entire academic paper. That's not really the point of an academic paper, to have a policymaker take away a couple of key ideas, right? We write those things for different reasons. So these are types of, knowledge mobilization strategies that we've used. And so right now we're developing an online e-learning platform on trauma and violence informed care, supported by a bunch of practice resources for people who want to shift their practice that way and organizations that want to implement that way. People love infographics or little data hits. You might have backgrounders or briefs as sort of mid-sized documents. And all of these need to be tailored for the audience. So you really need to know to whom you're speaking and make sure that you're doing it in a way that actually resonates with them. So you have to cut out a lot of the academic jargon. So this, I think, sort of maps out the space that we're talking about now, and maps out pretty well according to SSHRC's original definition that I showed you earlier. So my first big lesson is that evidence is only one kind of knowledge. And we talked a little bit before in my Venn diagram about, values, context, evidence. And these are the sorts of things. This is from a paper that was actually written around policy decision-making. All of the other factors that come into play and how the decision-making happens at the interface of these particular forms of knowledge. And, I would highlight here the practitioner expertise, or what we might call tacit knowledge, and also the, expertise of people with lived and living experience. So depending again on the field you work in, you want all of these forms of knowledge, and you don't want to create a hierarchy where the research evidence is privileged over these other forms of knowledge. You have to find a way of synthesizing those things that actually works in the real world. And then the broader environment, organizational context, those sorts of things. So things start to get complex pretty quickly. And I would say this diagram is from a book that we did a number of years ago on mediating health information is what we called it. But you can imagine, yourself or your elderly mom or a policymaker or a physician in the middle here going, there's just way too much coming at me. How am I supposed to process and apply all of the breadth of information? I don't even know what's good or bad information anymore, because bad information can be presented very, very, skillfully online now. It looks very credible, but it might not be. So this is the decision-making context in many cases. And I always feel bad for that user. I always have a user in the middle of my mind when I'm trying to develop new knowledge tools for people. And then we have these other factors. I alluded to them a little bit before, but you probably will be creating mismatches between what people have long held and done in their practice and their thinking, and what you think they should do based on the new evidence. So you're creating forms of cognitive dissonance in people, and some will get there with you, but you can't expect people to change their long-held beliefs and their long-standing practices overnight. It really does take, I think you need, again, that humility and that patience to bring people along and help them get there in terms of changing the way they think and do. And then the other point I want to make here is around the malleability of evidence. In this second paper that's listed down here, the uptake and framing of research evidence on screening for partner violence. So it was very interesting. We basically looked at how people interpreted the results of a trial that we had done on this topic, and people basically will cherry pick what they want and they will diss the rest. And I have brilliant examples, but that was a fun paper where people would say, well, we don't like the fact that they didn't find that screening was helpful, so we're saying that this paper was methodologically flawed. But we did like the outcome that said that there was no harm, so we're going to base our recommendations on the fact that this paper said there was no harm. And I'm thinking, if it's methodologically flawed, you can't like any of the results. Like, you can't say that it's methodologically flawed and then cherry pick some things you like and ignore the rest that you don't like. But that is how human beings sort of interact with evidence that goes against their beliefs, and that's the piece around cognitive dissonance. And you have to, I think, accommodate that and sort of deal with it as you think about the strategies for mobilizing knowledge. And I think it takes a lot of consultation with the sorts of folks you want to change their practices and to change their beliefs, to make sure that you're doing and saying things in the right way. So the second lesson is the 3 T's of partnership. So I wrote a paper a number of years ago called Talk, Trust, and Time. And it was cute to put 3 T's. I wanted them to all be T's, but under talk, it's actually listen. As I said, you know, those relationships need meaningful interaction and they need to be based on trust. So you do have to have a lot of face-to-face dialogue at the beginning. As you get more comfortable in the relationship, sure, you can use email, phone, whatever, Zoom now for everything, but you really do need that dialogue, and you need to listen to your partners and to those who you expect to take up the knowledge that you're generating. And that trust has different aspects to it. So I think, you know, the key one for me is you do what you say you're going to do. So if you are in a partnership with somebody and they call you up and say, look, I need everything you've got on this because my boss is presenting on it tomorrow, then, you know, even though you've got a paper you were supposed to work on today, you drop that and you help your partner because that's what they've asked you to do. And that's what it means to have a good bi-directional relationship. You also have to negotiate those priorities and those timelines. And, you know, those discussions really need to be had up front, including, I would say, the most important thing, which is to make sure that you've got values alignment around the work. And if you don't, you really need to think through whether you want to actually partner together. So in one of our projects, we used what we called a basis of unity document. It was like a terms of reference, but instead of just being about how we would work together, it was about why we would work together and what we were trying to accomplish. And the other piece that I would say it's very important to talk about is, what do you expect success to look like? And what do you expect failure to look like? Because not all studies will give you the evidence that you were hoping to have. That's why we do the research. So I think it's important to have that conversation up front. What if we don't find that our new intervention has ended poverty? Then what? You know, what are the implications? What are we going to communicate, and so on? And it's important to think about those things up front. And obviously, this all takes time and effort, and you need resources to do it. You can't try to build them in as an afterthought. You really need to think about it up front. This is all messy work. You know, these are humans interacting. People have their own agendas. They certainly, you know, all of my partners, we've always come together with a lot of goodwill, but things change. I find working with a lot of policy partners that within government, you know, roles change all the time. So you have a really good relationship with this policy analyst, and boom, they've moved to a whole other portfolio. So that, you know, you have to adapt to that. You have to look for those policy windows. And when they open, be ready to jump in, but they can also close very quickly. So that notion of opportunism, and then finding the right evidence at the right time. And I mentioned wasn't quite the fantasy model, but in our domestic violence in the workplace project, we did a large national survey and working in close partnership with the Canadian Labour Congress and many of their affiliates. And they were such fantastic partners that as soon as we had the evidence showing the impact of domestic violence in the workplace, they were right on it and pushing for policy change. And a lot of the new legislation around paid domestic violence leave arose from the findings of that research and was really pushed through by our research partners. So that was one of those, you know, not quite the fantasy model, but as close as I can give you an example of. You know, thinking about context is absolutely key. And I would say in problem spaces that many of you are working in, certainly that I work in gender-based violence and inequities, that complexity and even wickedness makes this all even more messy. So if we can't agree on what the definition of gender-based violence is, it's going to be difficult to come to a place of finding alignment and then being able to do research together. All right, so again, those conversations up front are important, and also building in the extra time and then trying to convince your funders why you need the extra time and money to do these things. So I think we really need paradigm shifts. You know, focusing on evidence-based processes fundamentally changes both the way that the policy and practice is done and the way that the research is done. And it's impossible to predetermine all your approaches and budgets and timelines because things shift in real time all the time. So, you know, you can write your knowledge mobilization plan in your SSHRC grant because you have to, but you also have to know that it will probably change over time as needs change, as the context changes, and so on. And I would say, you know, it's hard to be innovative without being disruptive. So we have a paper out from our equity work called Disruption as Opportunity, and really trying to create the good kind of disruption, not the chaotic kind, but the good kind of disruption that actually helps people shift to new ways of thinking and doing. I would say that we have an uneven fit between all of these evidence imperatives and the funding agency rules. As I mentioned before, academic culture and also academic incentive structures and bureaucratic processes, even the silos in academia that make it as hard as possible to do work in an interdisciplinary way. These all are things that we have to overcome to do the work in these ways. And I would love to start changing some of those structures in academia to make this a lot easier for all of us. And I always put this as a last bullet, like we need to leave that space for curiosity-driven research. So if all you're incentivized for and all you're funded for is answering existing problems brought to you by your practice and policy partners, it's hard to really break out of the box and do things that are completely innovative because you're just responding to existing problems. So we always need to keep a space for that, I think. So I guess, solutions or ruminations after all of my years of doing this work, it takes time, skill, and resources to do knowledge mobilization in good ways that are going to be impactful. And not everyone enjoys this or is good at it. So I do think, again, reinforcing the need for those intermediary or broker roles that are properly trained and funded. Also creating interaction opportunities between community stakeholders, policy folks, practice folks, whoever it is that might benefit from your research. It would be nice if there were more intentional opportunities, maybe created by our universities or by university community partnerships, to allow us to come together and have those discussions that could spark these new ideas. And we really need our systems to recognize and reward and fund knowledge mobilization, find ways to evaluate it and keep evolving the science of knowledge mobilization. So both sides need to be incentivized and supported. Again, it takes a long time for a policy person to sort of want to get into the research game and really, stay with you all the way through a project. They also have to be supported and incentivized. And our funders need to get that a little bit more. They can't just dictate that we have to write the knowledge mobilization plan. They have to understand that it takes time and money to do it. So when you add in sort of the notion of wicked problems or highly complex problems, I think it's important to have very consistent messaging to really ahead of time, even before you know what the results might be, to sort of have a strategy for how you're going to message things, whatever the results are, and make sure that you're not adding confusion. I think of what happened this week with the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations and their communication strategies, and I just sort of rolled my eyes. And so this needs to be sort of woven into those discussions you have with your partners. Always examine the systems and structures into which you're trying to move your new evidence. Many of them are harmful in the way they're structured. So we use terms like structural violence when we're talking about these sorts of things. And try to coordinate policies and services in ways that are trauma and violence informed and culturally safe. So understand where you're trying to insert your new evidence. And if you're adapting evidence to context, you want to make sure those adaptations are authentic and sustainable. And again, that takes a lot of work. So that's where a complexity lens can be very valuable. Understanding that complex interventions that are being integrated into complex adaptive systems, that's a lot of complexity, and it takes a lot of time and effort. And it also in some ways drives the research designs that are actually appropriate and relevant for doing that kind of work. I like to think about narratives and messages as evidence-based stories. So you really want to change how people think and feel about things. So marrying the evidence, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, with the story of why it's important, because you want to get at people's hearts as well as at their minds. And that really is grounded in the values that drive the work. And again, I mentioned the notion of disruption, the good kind of disruption. So that is what I wanted to present today. I usually would like another 10 minutes to flesh out a few things, but this is all of my contact information. I'm happy to take a couple of questions now. I think Kelly's going to see if any questions popped up in the Q&A, and you can certainly contact me at any of those venues.
Thank you very much, Nadine. That was boy, so much of that rung true, and especially the 17-year kind of thing. Okay, so Sarah, you spoke about the importance of relationships when doing this type of co-production work. I'm wondering if you have advice about walking the line between being critical while also needing to maintain and nurture relationships with various partners.
Yeah, so let me make sure I understand the question. So if I'm working with policy partners and I'm not 100% convinced that the policy environment is taking the issue on critically, how do I maintain my critical lens while still being a good partner and not starting to finger wag at people? Because you don't want to finger wag. That's important. And again, I think it is a skill set. So one of the things we did at Western, we started a graduate program in health information science, and the main theme is knowledge mobilization. So we try to give students the skills to be able to do that. But some of it is innate. So I think we start with a fundamental respect for everybody's role. We all have a different role to play in this. The notion of humility that I mentioned a couple of times in my talk is extraordinarily important. Just because we're academics, we have PhDs, whatever, you know what, that doesn't matter. That just means that our role is that we've been trained to be good at developing evidence and knowing how to develop a research and design a research project to get evidence. But their role is they understand what's going on in the world, in their policy space, in their practice space, in their community space. And how do we come together, again, around values to do the work in a respectful and win-win kind of way. I'm all about the win-win as well. Like there should be something in it for everyone because that's what keeps people going in the process. And to be realistic, like to really be upfront, like this is going to take a while. I know you want the answer tomorrow, but if we're doing a randomized trial, it's going to take, years, not months or weeks. And if that's not cool, then we need to know now. Before we get into this and things go sideways. Does that answer your question, Sarah? I hope so.
She says thank you. Yes.
Okay.
So Thomas has a question. How do you know the evidence that you hope will impact policy is, as you said, not disruptive so it can't be implemented? Isn't all change disruptive?
Yeah, no, I think you do need the disruption. So disruption is a good thing. It's just you don't want the chaotic kind of disruption. The notion of wicked problems also, and I think that gender-based violence is, would sort of meet those criteria. First of all, it's not just the solutions that are contested and difficult to find, but the problem keeps changing, right? So the problem bounces around. I always think of whack-a-mole, that game whack-a-mole. One pops up, you think you've got it, another one pops up. Although it's kind of a violent analogy, so maybe I should stop using that. But the idea is the problem changes, the solutions are difficult to pin down, and we probably don't agree on the nature of the problems and the ideal solutions to it. So that's where I think that additional complexity comes in. And also back to the importance of those early discussions and the values-based, really fulsome examination of the values that are bringing you into the work. If your partners are really only interested in reinforcing what they're already doing, and what you want to do is actually produce new knowledge to change that, just be clear up front, because it might not be a good partnership. I've been fairly lucky. Most of the partnerships that I've been in over the years have not always got the evidence that we all wanted and dreamed of, but the partnerships have been sustained, even if the evidence did not prove to be what we maybe had intended or hoped for at the beginning. We have a lot of negative or null trials behind us in many of the intervention studies that we've done. I could, again, have a little sidebar about that, but sometimes I don't think a trial is the best design for some of these complex interventions. I'll stop there.
One more question in the Q&A. Do you ever use creative arts, visual, or performance-based approaches to translating knowledge or communicating in knowledge mobilization initiatives? What does literature on knowledge mobilization have to say about creative arts, visual, performance-based approaches to translating knowledge and sharing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I personally have not led arts-based KT activities. However, I have close colleagues who do that and have done it in different sorts of projects. It is extraordinarily impactful and valuable, especially when you're communicating back to research participants, especially when you're trying to get across complex notions of experiences of trauma and violence. So a couple of my colleagues had a show actually based on their qualitative data with women who'd experienced violence. They had artists as well as some of the participants who had lived and living experience produce art that demonstrated what the data were, like actually what it felt like to have those experiences and then to come out of those experiences. We try to use really good graphic design for many of our products to get across, again, notions of a journey to safety. So we use graphic design to do that. And I think there are we've underutilized multimedia approaches to sharing knowledge beyond just the written word. So there's a lot of scope for that, and it is very impactful.
And a question in the chat: how have you found working with the media in terms of mobilizing?
You know what? I've worked with a few very, very good journalists. So I think if you get a journalist that you trust, you have to take the extra time sometimes to explain things to a journalist as well. And I think it's important to understand that there are few specialist journalists anymore. Like there used to be a health reporter for every venue. Now they're just pool reporters, right? So they might not know what, the depth of that background that you might be assuming. So I usually take a lot of time to either send stuff in advance to help explain complex things, or just take a lot of time to talk it through with them. And most journalists are there for the right reasons. They want to report the stuff accurately. They don't want to sensationalize. So I usually start with something like, it's important not to just go to the sensational, graphic, gory details of this particular violent episode that you're talking about. And we have to remember that, lots of people are experiencing lots of violence in a much less spectacular way every day, like the grind of everyday violence. So those sorts of educational messages really help. So I did one call-in show on a conservative talk radio. I will never do that again. But other than that, I've had good experiences, but I think you get out what you put in as well. And you do have to make the effort, and again, be respectful of where the journalist is coming from. The other tip to remember, the journalist doesn't write the headline. The editor writes the headline. And I've had many really good pieces written by journalists with a terrible headline that is very disempowering to the people that you're wanting to serve through your research. The journalist doesn't have control over that, but if you can preempt those bad headlines by maybe talking to the editor, that's not a bad thing.
I have a question for you. So in sort of recent years, I'm old, I'm dating myself, like mechanisms like the conversation, or like these kinds of bridging points between academia and sort of the public. What do you think the role, what do we lose in those and gain in those?
Well, I don't think we lose anything. I mean, I think the conversation, I've written a piece for the conversation, and it was a really great process. I do think you're reaching a certain segment of the general public. You're not reaching all of the general public. It's still a fairly high level, discourse that is going on in those conversation pieces. But I think as many tools as we can use to get across a consistent set of messages, the better. And I'm a big fan of the conversation. I think that, infographics, Twitter, I use Twitter a lot. It took me a while to convince myself to do it, but it is a very, very, high speed and impactful venue. Things can go sideways though. One of my senior colleagues, even older than me, asked me today, I think I need a Twitter lesson because I just don't know what to say. It's a bit intimidating. And I'm like, just be clear, be concise, and say what you want to say. And people will misinterpret it. That's just what happens on Twitter. And all of a sudden it can go haywire, but you can only do your best. So I think the more tools, the better. I have no problem with the conversation. If you're pre-tenure, you're going to have to make decisions though about how you spend your writing time. And again, that's a structure of the academy that if you've got a choice between a peer-reviewed journal article that's going to get you tenure and a conversation piece, probably just for from a survival perspective, you write your peer-reviewed publication, right?
I have more questions, but I think we're at our time. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to all the people who asked questions and people who listened. We will return at 7 o'clock for a panel on identities, vulnerability, and empowerment.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nadine. That was wonderful.